First up, we have Dr. Janine Owens, who is a research fellow at the University of Manchester. So Janine, whenever you're ready, if you'd like to take over, perfect. Thanks, Janine.
This presentation I'm going to share with you is when I worked at the University of Sheffield in the School of Clinical Dentistry, and I was in charge of the elective theme. The electives are final year projects that students undertake, and it's spread over 2 semesters, and part of the time they will go into a placement, which can be either in the UK or abroad, and they report on it. I'll tell you why I changed assessment during this and what the challenges were, and I'll give you an example of student work at the very end. Right, so why did I need to change assessment? When I first took over the theme, we had it was a handwritten diary and a word process diary that they'd been doing for 20 plus years, and it was a bit stale. And also the assessment that they had didn't evidence learning, and it lacked constructive alignment. It wasn't treated seriously by some of the students. They've quite often said, write anything, you get a good mark. And it didn't obviously address different abilities of students, but crucially, there was no social accountability within what they were doing. And I came to that conclusion when the bottom picture is obviously the temples of Angkor Wat. And I marked 30 projects one year, and out of 30, I matched two batches of 8 went to Cambodia, and each one reported on these temples, which was nice, but nothing was ever discussed about why they were delivering care voluntarily to people when they wouldn't be allowed to work in that way in the UK, why people were so totally reliant on a voluntary service. There was no question about continuity of care, and also there was no question about the reasons why there were no medical professionals available. So crucially, they didn't discuss anything about Khmer Rouge, about the killing fields, about professionals being shot on there. There was nothing as to why people were actually having to rely on voluntary care. Right, I encountered a lot of challenges. Those of you who work in academia will know what this is like. And I think the main one for me, apart from, for me, when people become very defensive and very reactive to change, it's because they're frightened of it. So what I did was I lobbied staff members who were amenable and would actually happily have a change of assessment. And bound up with this was my own fear of actually bringing in something very, very different to a very conservative department and to a conservative faculty, actually, that I worked in, that was so very, very different. One of the benefits was because I'm a social scientist, I knew a lot of people in different areas throughout the university, and I was quite active. And I knew a lot of people in the media department, and I got some media teaching for the students built in. And that itself was a challenge, because for those of you who work in medicine, the curriculum is jam-packed. So it was useful having them, and very, very useful having media to give the students some teaching. Students did all this on their own mobile phones, so they didn't have to have any specialist equipment. I think for me, it was important to have very, very clear learning outcomes. And when you work with the professional body, you've got, in effect, 2 masters. You've got their learning outcomes to actually address, and you've got the university outcomes as well. And sometimes it feels as if you're being pulled in 2 parts. For me to address that, I made sure that we had a very clear marking rubric which reflected those learning outcomes. And I also did a marking session for staff. A student very kindly gave me their video early. It was a practice video of what they'd done while they were out on elective, and we used that, and I used it in a session to mark for staff. I'll show you what they gave me. And I think another thing is not being too rigid about how they present a video. Students say they can do anything. They can do animation. They can do a photo montage. They can do vox pops, which is sort of a discussion, a documentary discussion. So not make it too rigid. And I think an important thing is probably to make communication a learning objective. I think that's probably vital within that rubric. For me, students had to communicate a very clear message as to what they were doing. Technical points. They've got to have a storyboard. They need to demonstrate the planning and changes. Top of the column, top of this picture here is SpongeBob SquarePants. That's a bit of a storyboard from a cartoon. I asked students to do field notes as well, to reflect on their learning. So any seminal reading that was important for them, or things that they thought were important for the video that sort of promoted it to be produced in a certain way. Another rule was they had to make sure the video was no longer than 4 minutes. And I think that's essential. Any longer than that, you tend to lose the will. And also the students needed to focus tightly on a message. So 4 minutes is adequate, no more than 4 minutes. And I built an online teaching area within the students' virtual learning environment with guidance, tips, a discussion board that they could help each other out on, and which I could also offer advice as well. Because it was on a mobile phone, I made sure that students regularly uploaded to the cloud or a similar storage area, so if they lost the phone, they hadn't lost all the work. Benefits. I think the biggest challenge is people's negative assumptions about what constitutes an academic assessment. And that comes from obviously fear and a lack of understanding about the different forms of assessment that we can engage with within academia. And it takes time to develop, and I can't emphasize that enough. Developing a rubric which accurately reflects the learning outcomes and segments the video. We didn't mark in terms of the quality of the video. We marked in terms of the message and the actual process of what the student understood and the depth of their knowledge, how they deepened it as a result of going out on placement. That to me was very, very important. I had 4 weeks to develop everything, which really is not long enough. You could do it about 6 months, I would say, to develop things properly. 4 weeks wasn't dedicated 4 weeks. 4 weeks was on top of my work schedule as well. So there was a lot of very late nights involved there to get it done in time. You need technology. You need technology involved because you need somewhere to upload and store those videos ready for your markers to become engaged with, obviously. And for us, importantly, we got students to focus on the ethics of what they were doing. So they weren't allowed to video patients and people in the streets unless they had express permission. But we made patients a no-no because of the power differential between people receiving treatment and people giving it. So we said no to patients. The biggest benefit I found was, I don't think we pay or we give students enough credit for the amount of creativity. The range of videos that were produced by students was amazing. And also their focus was obviously greatly enhanced as to what they were actually looking at. Okay, just give you a little bit. There's no sound apparently. What I will say is, out of probably, there were 68 students that did this assessment, 2 failed. And out of the 2 that failed, the 68 were incredibly creative. And reflections from staff were that it was far more enjoyable marking this. Students found it far more interesting to do, and also look at the fact that they were very, very focused on what it was that they really wanted to look at, the importance of a particular area. The 2 that failed just took pictures of motorbikes because their supervisor was a motorbike enthusiast, and they thought that would get them to pass. You know, you live and learn, don't you? So they had to redo what they did, but it was quite easy because of the footage that they'd shot. When they brought it to me, said, well, you could look at the social determinants of health and question what was going on. They were in Thailand, so it was interesting, very interesting. I shall stop there, probably.
That's absolutely perfect. And I don't see any questions coming in on the VVox, but I actually had one myself, and it was in relation to that rubrics. What advice would you give to someone starting off choosing video for assessment? Where would they start with that rubric?
Right, well, I looked at a lot of different rubrics. I Googled rubrics, I looked at what people had done. Yeah, 4 minutes is plenty in all situations. Any longer than that, if you sort of sit there and you start to watch videos, you'll find that 4 minutes is probably most people's tolerance point. So, and 4 minutes is enough to get a message across, because you're aiming at communicating a message. You can lose that message in that period of time. Yeah, I Googled a lot of different rubrics, and it took me a long time to decide what it was that fitted the learning outcomes that I wanted to produce. And as I say, we weren't interested in the quality of the video. We were interested in the message and what they were presenting and what they got across. So I can give you an example of the rubric. I've got one up here.
Lovely, that'd be fabulous. And in terms of the 4 minutes, is that pertaining to a certain amount of credits? Presumably, if there's more credit worth, the video will have to be longer.
No, I think it doesn't. No. It's got nothing at all to do with the amount of credits. The 4 minutes is to get students to focus down to tell a concise story and a concise message within a short period of time. You tend to find that when you lengthen a video, people ramble. Yeah. And did staff attitudes change? Yes, they did. I wasn't the thing of being met in the lift with "not a good morning, how are you, Jan?" Being met in the lift with, "I think your idea about video is rubbish," and it was just like, "Oh yeah, tell it like it is, won't you?" It was quite demoralising before I went into developing this. Some of the attitudes that staff had, but yes, they did, because it cut down marking time, and it was actually became a pleasurable process. So yes.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated by it. It's something I've been looking at for a while, and I think you gave everyone a great little introduction to it there now, and some of those basics that are really, really important, like the length and rubrics and that. Thanks a million, Janine.
You're welcome.
So next up we have Dr. Kieran O'Halloran, so a reader in applied linguistics at King's College London. So Kieran, if you're ready to go, you can take over. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks, Geraldine, for inviting me. So title of my talk is Digital Creativity and Assessment, Making Videos of Poems on Mobile Phones. So my talk comes out of a module that I teach at King's College, where I work, and students, it's called Film Poetry Style, where students make films of poems on their mobile phones. And the reason for doing this is to foster their creative thinking and to foster their adaptability. So, because in principle, students from across the university can take this module and have creative resources released in a completely new context. Now, that's creative thinking is obviously a useful thing to foster, but there's another reason for getting into this is because more and more employers want creative thinkers. I got this from LinkedIn Learning. where they did an analysis of tens of thousands of job adverts in 2020. And creativity is the top soft skill, interestingly, and adaptability is in there as well. And one of the reasons for this is the march of AI. More and more companies want to know what to do with it, and they're seeking creative ideas in relation to AI. And of course, adaptability is a key skill because the pace of change, particularly in relation to tech advancement. And what's really interesting also is just how, as a hard skill, video production is creeping up there. So what we're all interested in here is clearly something to get into and advance and so on. So if in designing a creative thinking pedagogy, of course, it helps to have an understanding of what creativity is, and of course, it's clearly a multifaceted phenomenon. But one sort of key element within it is unusual connection making and unusual juxtapositioning of different elements. And there are countless quotes on this, such as from the surrealist artist Max Ernst: creativity is that marvelous capacity to grasp mutually distinct realities and draw a spark from their juxtaposition. And a related quote from a couple of educationalists, Bill Lucas and Ellen Spencer: making connections, seeing new links between ideas is an important aspect of the synthesizing process of creative thinking. Now, making films of poems is absolutely ideal for realizing this idea of unusual connection making, because in the genre, what tends not to happen is a filmmaker thinks to themselves, well, how can I realize the intentions of the poet as accurately as possible in the audio-visual mode? That's not usually what happens. What is pretty standard is the poem is used as a springboard into an alternative vision. So the filmmaker, the video poet, as it were, juxtaposes their own vision, cinematic vision, with the poem. So thus realizing the unusual connection making inherent within creativity. And that's something I'm trying to get students to develop. Okay, so that's what they're expected to do, okay, to create an alternative vision around the poem. And I'll show this in a moment. Another thing that is inherent within creativity, of course, as I said, it's multifaceted. It's not just a set of skills, it's also a set of dispositions. And one of them is the personal capability of boldness, putting out a vision and, and standing by it. So that's the first creative connection making that students are expected to make on the module. I'll show this with some stills rather than a film, although I've got a film within an article that it's coming out very, very shortly. I can put in the chat if you want to see an entire student film. But this is a female student made a film of the E. Cummings poem, "I carry your heart with me, I carry it in." And this is a 17-line poem, and this is the first stanza. I carry your heart with me, I carry it in my heart, I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. Now, E. Cummings intended it as a love poem. It reads as a love poem, and that's usually how it's generally understood. A little bit of internet research tells me that it's read out at weddings. Okay, so the student decided, not to go with that, but to have a kind of bold vision around the poem, perhaps going a bit too bold, because they played with the idea of love and thought, well, what if the love here is unrequited? And what if it's really unrequited because the person who is doing the loving is clearly highly dysfunctional? So what they decided to do in their film, which they made with the help of student peers, is a film of a stalker, right, who followed the object of his affection down the escalators into the London Underground. And here are some stills off the first verse, okay, around the first verse. So you've got your first creative connection making here, clearly a context which wasn't intended by the poet, but has a transformative effect on that poem, because no longer is it seen as something positive, but I carry your heart with me, I carry it in, which is now the interior monologue. You hear this voiceover while he's following her down the escalator and so on onto the tube carriage, thus with this voiceover transforming the poem into something very sinister. You know, I carry your heart with me now sounds pretty grim. So that's the first creative connection making. There's a second creative connection making that the students are expected to perform, and that's to pay attention to foregrounded features of style and use those foregrounded features to motivate creativity in the film. So that could be in shot design, it might be in use of audio effects or video effects. And the two foregrounding of style basically falls into two types: that which is unusual, okay, so unusual use of language in a poem, and repeated use of language. And you can see the punctuation is quite unusual because of the lack of spacing, with the commas and the semicolon, the brackets, okay, spacing with preceding and succeeding words, very compressed. Well, they use that as a motivation for the London Underground, rather than, you know, choosing an open space like a field and so on. So that adds to the sense of compression, and clearly the person being stalked is clearly going to feel under threat from this compression. And the other aspect here that I just want to draw attention to that the student picked up on was the repetition of the brackets. And there's brackets across this poem. It's a very brackety poem. And they use that to design a set of shot curves. Okay, so all sorts of curves occur to them. So, for example, the opening shot of the stalker, who's played by a student, you've got he's got a sort of a stooped neck. So he's an opening bracket, okay, because of the curve of his head and neck and back. You've also got the curve of the hoodie, and then you've got the serendipitous curves of the London Underground. You've got the curvature of the space where the escalator is, the mirror, and then finally, what I thought was really cool, the way they brought together the final bracket of stanza 1 and creating a bracket in the image. So because they shot the tube carriage at an angle, they created the geometry of the curve, okay, which then becomes a closing bracket, as it were, because the door was shut, and adding to that sense of compression and, of course, dread on the part of the stalked woman. So just one more slide. I thought people would want to know a little bit about how the module is assessed. So the assignment can be done individually, or it can be done in a pair. There's 3 components. Of course, the film, it doesn't have to be a long film. All I ask for is a minimum of a minute. Most students produce somewhere around sort of 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. And it's collaborative. So even if they submit as a pair, if they want to do something elaborate, then it helps to have, of course, actors, a number of actors rather than just one, and also alternative camera operators who are providing, you know, this alternative footage, which is great because that will, you know, you don't know what you're going to get as the director, and you can have a look at, you know, fairly surprising footage, which may be giving you, ideas in the edit. So that's useful to have. There's a report of 2,500 words where they indicate the analysis of what the foregrounded features of the poem's style, an explanation of how that style analysis drives creativity in the film through, for example, like what we just saw, the curves in that student's film. And then they bring in some stills from the film to ground the explanation. And then finally, there's a shot list just in note form, 500 to 1,000 words, with the stylistic drivers and indicating where features of style are actually driving aspects of creativity in the film. And this is the final shot list, so it's a record of what they actually did. I encourage them to produce a working shot list before they go out there and shoot, because then it gives them some organization, of course, rather than just what shall I shoot now? You know, it's too open-ended. But clearly, when they engage with the environment, things will occur to them, such as the use of the mirror in the underground and the tube carriage and so on. Okay, so very useful to have a working list, shot list. So they're assessed for the creativity in their interpretation of the poem and how the style has been used to motivate creativity in shot choice and effect and so on. The artistic quality is not assessed because we're not, this module doesn't come out of, a BA in media production or anything like that. I just have to be able to see the film and hear it, but I'm not expecting, fairly fancy stuff like color grading. And that's it, really. As I said, I mentioned an article that's about to come out. But if anyone's interested, I'm very happy to send the article. And it's based around a student film where there's a link to the student film on YouTube.
Thanks very much, Kieran. I found that absolutely fascinating. And I wouldn't work with that kind of creative kind of group, but even the way that thing with the brackets at the end was, I don't look at things around me enough, I think, often sometimes when I see things like that. I think it's a really important point you made that we don't actually take those the quality bits into account, that it's more going back to the rubric, the learning outcomes, what's the intent from it. So we do have one interesting question in addition, and it's, did you come up against any negative attitudes from staff?
No, not really. I mean, the university I work in it's quite keen to promote new forms of assessment, and I think post pandemic, there's definitely a catalyzing of interest in video because people have just been using video, and these kind of symposia are now pretty normal, aren't they? So yeah, no problems whatsoever. Do the non-English degree students get excited about poetry? Okay, that's interesting. It's very difficult to know. I'm not so sure they get excited. I think they get more excited in being able to do something creative. So that's what's been really interesting about it, that there's always been a hunger, I think, for people to do something creative, because generally it's a pleasurable thing, but we've always put it in the pockets of the day. It's something you do at the weekend, and that's obviously been misguided in relation to assessment. But I suppose also it's a lot easier to be creative with, as I found, with a video of a poem rather than expecting students to produce poetry. All right, and that's it's a much harder module to run because you've got to get a creative writing professional in to do that, I think. So those modules do exist and they're brilliant and everything, but they're run by professionals and people who've actually been published. But to get students to use the technology to do something creative, they just need a little bit of a push. They need the opportunity to do it. But they can do all sorts of really interesting things without necessarily being professional videographers or necessarily wanting to go down that route. It's I get students from, I'm based in education, and so my background is linguistics, but I get students from psychology, I get students from English literature. We have a split in our university. It's kind of the classic split of English language linguistics and literature on completely different sites. But I get literature students, psychology students. I've had some social science students. I had a law student once. But many of them do actually have a background in filmmaking, so they're looking for something to do which is going to enable their creativity and keep that aspect of them alive, as it were. So yeah, my experience is there's a hunger to be creative from our undergraduates anyway.
Great. Thanks a million, Kieran. And I'd just like to thank everyone that gave their input today and asked questions. So I'll hand you back to Geraldine now for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Aoife. And thanks to all the speakers. It's always difficult being the last speaker or the first speaker. I suppose just in conclusion, this conference, I suppose from the perspective of the organizer, it has lived up to my expectations massively in terms of the quality of presentations from all the speakers and the variety of disciplines that they come from. And after today, I can see all the possibilities. There's fantastic possibilities from using video in the classroom. And it was lovely to see how passionate everyone is and how much effort was put into making assessment modern and authentic and relevant, which is what we want our students to graduate with. So I'm going to make a few sort of notes of thank you. I made some at the introduction this morning, but I would like to thank again all of our speakers who have been so generous with their time, and any communication I've had with them over the last number of months has been trouble-free, I can tell you. So thank you to all of them, and to our chairs today who managed time beautifully as well. And I would like to thank Ruth Benson in our Learning and Teaching department who managed all the registrations. Now, we actually had over 100 people register for the conference. Many opted to receive a recording. Obviously, it's middle of semester and people are busy, so it's great that we will be able to share this with a much larger audience than we're here today. So I would also like to thank Helen Bradley, and Helen looked after the waiting room and letting people in and out of the room today. So I suppose a few others who aren't here. So the other co-organizer of the conference, Anne-Marie O'Brien, unfortunately couldn't be here due to unforeseen circumstances, but in her absence, I would just like to thank her for all her support, obviously in organising this, and Nuala Harding, who's head of the Department of Learning and Teaching, for all her support and advice in running and organising something like this. Also, again, to Frances O'Connell, our Vice President for Education and Student Experience, who opened the conference this morning. So without further ado, I shall close the conference. It's been a long day for everyone, but I'm delighted that everybody has hung in, and I learned a lot myself, having come into this really as a curious person rather than a practitioner myself. So thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.